come ride with me. It's time to saddle up right away. There's so much to see. Don't worry, I know the trails, I know the way.
This is Dauphin with Dauphin Horsemanship. We're here today to finally finish our Bit About Bits series on leverage bits. This one is on finishing bits. I do feel like there's a few things we could quickly review just to make sure that everybody's on the same page with this. First of all, the 7 pressure points that we use on the horse's head to communicate. We talked about the tongue, the corners of the lips, and the bars in the snaffle bit video. These 3 pressure points snaffle bits use. When we get into leverage bits, we're adding at least 2 more. The chin and the pole are definitely going to be used on any leverage bit. And now in the finishing bits, we may well also be starting to use the palate for communication as well. Now, a bit, in order to be considered capable of touching the palate, we need to have a port of 2 inches or greater. And the reason for that is a horse can open its mouth to escape the port. You know, hopefully it wouldn't, but they could, until you get to greater than 2 inches. And when we're into larger ports than that, then they really can't escape anymore. So that's generally where we consider a bit working on the palate. Now, a bit with a 1-inch port could touch the palate if the horse were comfortable with it and didn't open its mouth. Okay, so you can still be using the palate with a smaller bit. Quickly, the various parts of a curb bit. The entire length of the side from the top of the ring to the bottom of the bottom ring is going to be called the cheek. And you'll notice that the top rings on my drawing here slant out. That is the way that any shank bit should be set up. The bars of the bit are these side portions of the mouthpiece right here that coordinate with the bars of the horse's mouth. The port is generally going to be a raised section in the middle, which does not necessarily need to be on a shank bit. The upper portion of the cheek, which is going to be from the mouthpiece to the top of the top ring, is going to be called the purchase. The lower portion of that, from the mouthpiece to the bottom of the bottom ring, is called the shank. It is the ratio of length of the purchase to the shank that gives us the leverage ratio for the bit. Getting back to the leverage ratios and all, to me at least, where that really becomes important in how we're going to approach the use of our shanked bit is in the speed that bit is going to have. So we talked about this in the transition bits video, but if we were to say that the horse's face was pointing in this direction, this red dot right here is the center of the mouthpiece, and the straight line up and down is the cheek of the bit. This particular bit, we have an 8-inch shank and a 2-inch purchase on it. If we were to pull back 6 inches on that shank, this is the blue area there, is the amount that we would have rotated the port or the purchase of the bit forward. So that is essentially the actual action of the bit. Alright? So 4-to-1 leverage ratio, we don't really have a very large action area of our bit. Down here we have a 5.5-inch shank and our same 2-inch purchase. We have pulled our shank back the same 6 inches, and now you can see our blue area is almost twice as large. Okay, so what this is illustrating is the speed with which your bit is acting in the horse's mouth. So for the same amount of pull for the rider, more happens in the horse's mouth. More is pulling on the horse's chin and pole with a shorter shank than a longer one. A little further illustration of that principle, if we drop down to a 3-inch shank with the same 2-inch purchase, you can see now we have a massive rotation inside the horse's mouth. And if we go to a longer 5-inch shank but only a 1 1/4 inch purchase, we're again into a higher leverage ratio even though we still have a short cheek. So don't be fooled by length of cheek. Where that mouthpiece lies inside the cheek is what determines that ratio. A 6-inch cheek could have a 6-to-1 leverage ratio or a 1-to-1 leverage ratio, depending on where the mouthpiece is placed inside that cheek. Okay, so that's a very, very key thing. People will often look at a long cheek and immediately think that it means a high leverage bit, and that's not at all true. There's a specialty bit that reining people will use a lot called an elevator bit, and it has a very long cheek on it, but it actually has a 1-to-1 ratio or no leverage because the mouthpiece is right in the center. Don't be fooled by cheek length. It is that ratio that matters. Tongue relief. What it really amounts to is a gap in the mouthpiece of a bit where the horse's tongue can go, and he can remove the most sensitive part of his mouth from the link of communication and have the bit operate just on the bars inside the mouth anyway. So this mouthpiece style, this would be what's considered a half-breed, and it would be the generally speaking, it would be the first mouthpiece in a spade bit that we would put a horse into. You will sometimes see, you could see a bar bit that had just a little bit of tongue relief in it and still had that same type of mouthpiece. Half-breed is what it's called. So you see this bit's got just a little bit of a hump right there in the center. This would be a very similar mouthpiece, but with some tongue relief. Straight bar bit, zero tongue relief. This wouldn't be a very uncommon bit. Sometimes you might hear that called a mullen style mouth with just a little bit of a hump to it. This is going to have, again, very modest tongue relief. The mouthpiece that I've drawn here on the bottom, and I've never seen one that actually mirrored that. Again, this is just an example, but it is both very tall and very open. So this mouthpiece has way more tongue relief than any of the others. And again, you wouldn't really ever see a mouthpiece that looked like that. I'm simply using it to illustrate all of the area that the horse's tongue could go into. And this bit, I actually have one with a very similar mouthpiece to that right there. While it does have about a 1-inch tall port, because it is so narrow here, it has very little tongue relief. Now tongue relief, there are really two aspects, two dimensions to how it works. First of all, we have the width of the bit, so the horse can withdraw their entire tongue up into that. But remember that the port isn't pointing up on the horse's tongue; it's laying back and going, at an angle back into the horse's head toward his ears. And if you were to look at a horse's tongue, there's an area on the tongue. Let's say that his tongue is coming back like this, and our corners of the mouth and all relatively about right there, and the molars would start sort of back here. This area of the tongue right here is the thinnest portion of it. It's a part of the tongue we would call the tongue groove. Directly behind that portion of the tongue, there is sort of a knot, and as soon as the horse constricts his tongue, tries to withdraw it, this area is going to bulge up. Okay, so when we get into a bit of a taller port, that port is sitting back in the horse's mouth like so, and helping to avoid that big knot. So tongue relief is not just about width. The height of the port and accommodating that knot in the tongue is an aspect of it as well. So sometimes people will look at a taller port and they will immediately think that port is cruel and things along those lines, and that's not necessarily true at all. Again, the very most important part of any bridle, and what has most to do with whether that bridle is severe or mild, is the hands holding the reins. Okay? So again, half-breed type mouth, a straight bar bit, 0 tongue relief. And you can see that the port of this, this little area in the center there is meant to be a cricket or a roller. That would be sitting directly on that portion that knots up in the horse's tongue, and that would be where the horse would be playing with it. So tongue relief is a bit of a misnomer. It really has more to do with the rider than it does the horse. So if we were to take a horse that had a virgin mouth and we started it, and it had someone with a very, very, very good set of hands on it, and they went all the way through the bits and up into this area, this bit with 0 tongue relief, which is acting almost solely on the most sensitive part of the horse's mouth, the tongue, that could still be a perfectly viable bit. Okay, the horse wouldn't need tongue relief because it was being handled by a person with a very fine set of hands. So the relief portion there really has as much to do with relief from the rider and their hands and the way they're using the bit as it does the horse needing it. A horse just holding a bit in his mouth wouldn't have any discomfort. There's really no need for the tongue relief. I would hope, if you've seen some of the other videos, that I've hammered home the point here that what we really want a horse to do when they're comfortable and accepting of the bit is to pick it up with their tongue and hold it, which is the tongue groove and the big knot in their tongue. That's what all of that is there, perfectly designed to do. So the port and all gives the horse something to hold on to. And very frequently I will find that horses are absolutely comfortable with large ports in their mouth. We had discussed in the snaffle bit video the surface area of bits. If you think about, we'll go here and we'll do another spade style, our half-breed mouth. If we were to add some little ears onto that, and a spoon, and braces off of the ears, okay, we now have a full-on spade bit. And all that these braces and that spoon do is gives that horse more surface area with which to grab that bit and hold it. Okay? Now this will take some getting used to. I'm not saying you could go put this in a colt that's never had a bit in its mouth and he would just accept it and be great. That's not what I mean at all. But looking at a bit like that absolutely doesn't mean that cruelty is occurring either. This is a bit that you would ride very, very lightly with. But like we said, as it has no tongue relief and all of the other things that are added, this is a bit that would only be for a very experienced horseman with good hands and a highly trained horse. Okay? When we get into more what you would call the Texas style bits that have lots of tongue relief, those are really bits that have accommodations. They have room for error built in for you and for the horse. Alright? When we get into spade bits, we have less and less room for those errors. One thing I really want to hammer home with this is the usage of the bit, and I don't think I've done a video yet on the snaffle. I have alluded to lateral flexion being incredibly important here. If you have a horse that's a bit of a runaway, you don't have much control of him, the solution isn't to go to one of these great big bits and lots of leverage. The solution is to break him down with one rein and get lateral flexion back. Okay, so these bits are only for horses that are fairly educated already on these pressure points, and they have a great understanding and a great bit of obedience already. They are not for green horses. They are not for green riders. Okay? And again, as I travel around, I very frequently am seeing horses that are unprepared for the bit that's in their mouth, and riders that don't come close to having the hands to handle the bit that they've got in their mouth. And that's sort of what I'm hoping to alleviate with these videos. I hope that we have maybe shed some light in some dark corners and given you a method to the madness. A lot of people seem to just randomly try bits, and there's no need to be random about it. They have very specific mechanical uses and methodologies as to what should work for what particular reason, and we'll get into that a little bit deeper in this video. But in a nutshell, that is what tongue relief is. And please do remember the big knot on the back of the tongue behind the tongue groove. It is, you know, a lot of people would think of tongue relief as an area for the horse to withdraw their tongue up into the port. Very few people would understand about that knot right there and the way that the bit would be sitting on the tongue when it's in a complete relaxed state. And that's every bit as big a part of how a port works as anything else. In fact, like a port like this, when we're having full contact with the tongue, we have zero tongue relief here. The port, you know, when the shank is pulled and the port is rotated and it leaves the tongue, it's pretty hard for the horse not to notice all of that steel leaving the tongue. So that's why this bit has so much more signal to it than something pretty simple like this or this. Okay? It has that pre-signal of when that port and all of that is leaving the horse's mouth. If we want to really get technical, and I'm assuming if you've hung with me through all of these videos, when we get into the braces here, and this comes back, this is really getting back to the fork in the road where English and Western separated. If you go to a high level dressage horse, they're going to be ridden in a double bridle. Not a two rein, a double bridle, which means there are actually two different bits in the horse's mouth. There's going to be a Berdoon snaffle and then the curb bit. Well, what this bit is going to mimic, the braces are similar to the snaffle. So one of the things we've talked about in other videos is that a horse should sort of be sucking on a bit. And if you'll just bear with me for a second and close your mouth. If you're standing there with your mouth closed right now, you will please be conscious of the fact that you are slightly sucking on your mouth. So your tongue is touching the roof of the mouth, and the suction is what helps keep your lips closed. You can't stand there with your mouth closed and not be sucking on a little bit. You will automatically have air start to come in because you're not holding your lips closed. A horse holding the bit should be exactly the same thing. Okay? So what I think when I see a horse that has a lot of froth at the mouth, or foam, or any of those things, that is a horse whose suction is being broken frequently, and the air that's being introduced into his mouth is what's causing the froth or the foam. If you see a normal person standing there and you saw foam coming down their mouth, what would you automatically think about that person? What it tells me about a horse is that the horse is not swallowing. I am not at all a fan of seeing a lot of foam on a horse's mouth. Are there times when I'm riding colts and maybe we have certain problems and I'm needing to push here or push them there and maybe handle them a little more than I would ideally like to handle them? Well, yeah, that's what's called training. And in those certain circumstances, I may well have some days where my horse has more foam on his mouth. My point of doing that to the horse is to motivate him to soften up and come to me so that I don't need to handle him that way to get the reaction that I'm looking for. Okay? So, with these braces right here, we now have the two separate pieces coming out of the corners of the horse's mouth, just like a high-level dressage horse would have with the Berdoon and the curb. Whenever you are pulling back on the shanks, that brace is lifting the top lip up, and the curb portion, the bar here is pushing the top lip down, and we are introducing air into the horse's mouth. And I would promise you, just as you wouldn't appreciate if you were standing there comfortably with your mouth closed and I came and did this and allowed air into your mouth, the horse doesn't like that either. That small thing, the noticing of how you have changed the suction in the horse's mouth, that is what should be motivating the horse to respond to the bit. When we're getting into these other things, when we've got horses that have got these flash nose bands holding their mouth shut and foam coming out, and we've got blue tongues and the horse swallowing his tongue and all, just think how way far beyond simply moving suction around we are when we're at that level. Those are failures of a rider. So there's another video on YouTube that's very popular, unfortunately, because it's full of misinformation, and it is something on the effects of the bit and how bits cause pain, and they've got all these wonderful little graphics, way better than my graphics in there. But you know, it misses that fundamental understanding of what a bit should operate on. When you are touching the horse's tongue, you have such a sensitive organ right there to work with that there's really no need to get into the other stuff. When you're seeing the horses that are swallowing the tongue, that have to have their tongue tied into their mouth and all of that kind of stuff, you're not seeing a failure of a horse, you're seeing a failure of the rider. You're seeing someone that does not understand how bits should work, that their hands are just brutal. And they're probably not doing that on purpose. I would hope that they're not sadistic and they're out to cause pain in the horse. They're simply ignorant. And hopefully after watching all of this, you won't be. A simple change in suction, a simple touch here and there. I mean, imagine, you may have noticed there have been some flies flying around here in my office. If a fly were to come up and land on my lip, how light would that be? And yet I would find that unbearably ticklish. I would have to move that fly. Well, you know, you're using these bits and touching the same area of the horse, right? If a fly landed on a horse's lip, he would certainly feel it. So only slight movements of the bit are what we need to communicate. We may need to pull harder and things, but these are really getting into disciplinary issues beyond communication. There are so many variations of mouthpieces available for curb bits that there's no way I could possibly cover them all. I'm sure I'm unaware of hundreds of different forms of them. So again, all I'm trying to get you to understand here is certain mechanics and how changing this will affect that, and then you can evaluate your own bit. These are some, let's say, a very skeletonized grouping of some different mouthpieces that you might see commonly, and some variations in there, and just a few things of what they're for. Again, with curb bits, there's by far more variation in what can be done in the mouth than what you would see with snaffle bits. So there's no way I could possibly cover every sort of a mouthpiece, and I'm sure there'll be ones that I'll be, as I watch this and edit it to put out there, there's going to be ones that I'm going to be thinking of that I wish that I covered. So you're certainly welcome in the comments to ask any other sorts of questions. But again, here are just some basic things with the mouth. This would be what we would call a square port bit. And the square portion of the port, as we lift that off of the horse's tongue, it is going to be hitting, you know, if we were to look at the roof of a horse's mouth, it's going to be domed, and then the tongue would be fitting in here like this. So as we have a square port, these corners of the port would be hitting here and here quicker. Alright, so a square port is generally going to have a little bit more bite because it's going to hit the roof of the mouth in those 2 points, whereas a normally domed port would be more evenly distributing pressure. So a square port generally is used on a horse that might have a bit more bite, okay, generally. This bit, again, would be a fairly basic mouth style, but where I have these two the portions where the bar and the port meet, those are meant to be hinges, okay? So this would be a correction bit. This is a correction mouth, and you can see that it swivels here at the port on both sides. So as you're pulling back on the reins of this bit, you're also collapsing the mouth onto the bars and the sides a little bit. And this is very common. You'd hardly find a Western trainer in the United States or around the world that doesn't own one of these and ride with them regular. The name correction is really quite unfortunate because they're not very harsh bits. They can, again, with the hands on the reins, they can be made to bite a horse pretty good, but they really aren't nearly as bad as what a name like correction might lead you to believe. You'll also notice that this bit, it only swivels the one direction. If I pull on just one of these rings, that entire bit is going to rotate together. Okay, so that's one way to have hinge points. If we change that to where we only have one hinge point, and you'll usually find it in the center, this would be called a single jointed mouthpiece. A typical snaffle mouthpiece would have your two rings in the center. It again only has a joint in the middle. So what a single joint in the middle is going to give you is more independent side motion. So here we have my little Argentine shanked single jointed snaffle. On this bit I can pull back on one side, and you can see that I don't really affect the other side. Alright, so this bit is going to have more independent lateral side action than a solid curve or a double jointed bit with. So let's say that I have a horse that really drops shoulders badly. I might have a square port bit with a hinge right in the center, and I've got my ability to bite a little more on that corner and lift an individual shoulder. Okay, so I know that's kind of quick, but that's broadly how that sort of thing works. Some other little add-ons that you might see. This again is our typical curved mouth, but we've got a little bar welded here in the center and some rollers or some little copper rings or something put there. Again, with that horse's tongue, and we had the bit groove and the knot right behind the bit groove. That knot may be playing with those rollers, and if we had a horse that did have a little bit of a nervous mouth, that might help to pacify him, but his mouth outwardly would look pretty calm and relaxed. The copper also is going to promote salivation, so hopefully the horse is going to be working that tongue and swallowing. Okay, so having something like that in there doesn't hurt things. Now you'll notice when we're putting a bar in here, we are taking away some of our tongue relief. Okay, but again, if your hands are good, you're using good methodology, the tongue relief loss shouldn't really be a big deal because you really shouldn't need it in the first place. And then another way that you might see some copper or something added on would be in the bar areas of the mouth. Frequently they'll have large copper rollers right there. I would really have to say this would be one of the least effective ways of adding something like that to the bit. You know, you're not really adding a roller for the hinge action. It's you know, looks nice, but to me, this is probably the least effective way of doing that. I guess I had already shown the half-breed mouthpiece, so we would have a straight bar here with the half-breed, and then in the center of that port, we would have a copper cricket. Crickets will generally make a clicking noise as the horse is working them with the tongue, so you can ride and literally hear as your horse is playing with the bit. I've seen some that were loud enough that kind of annoy me. I kind of like to ride horses because it's a pretty quiet day out there, and if I'm hearing a ratchet all the time, that kind of disturbs the quiet for me. But I would say a well-made cricket isn't that loud. So a roller and a cricket have similar function, but they are not exactly the same thing. Alright, this area here I'm just doing to illustrate an angle in our bit that is very important. In most of these illustrations here, I was talking about the top portion, the blue, illustrating the purchase, but it could also illustrate what the port is going to do. The port and the purchase are going to move exactly the same degree, but we of course may have a port that is only this tall when the purchase would go all the way up here. If we got into our full-on spade with a 4-inch spoon on it, we may well have our purchase here, and the port may come well above the top of the purchase. So, you know, that just adds a lot more blue area to that section. What I really want you to take note of, generally speaking, we do want our purchase and our port to be in a line. So looking at a bit from the side, okay, let me get this shank correct, you're not really going to see that port, okay, because it is in a straight line with the purchase. That is not always the case. Generally that's where we would want it. But you could see, let me change colors here, you could see a bit that when looked at from the side, the port were to come up at a backwards angle from the purchase. There are other bits, a Sweetwater would be an example, where the port would be in front. Let's say that the horse's nose would be in this direction. So the port would be in front of the purchase. It is the angle of the port that determines how the bit sits in the horse's mouth. One other mouthpiece that I really intended to talk about is a mouthpiece that I like quite a bit, and it's called a spoon mouth. What a spoon mouth is it can be lots of different shapes of ports, but the upper portion of the port here is flattened. So if we were looking at it from the side, and the circular area is the bars of the bit, the round stock there, as we go up into the port, we're hammering that down and thinning it. It to me is a very functional mouthpiece. Again, when we talk about surface area, and this would be a head-on shot of the horse's mouth with the roof of the mouth up here and the tongue lying underneath. Our bit is fitting in this gap. Particularly, excuse me, particularly if you have a horse that has a thicker, coarser type of tongue. Having a 7/16 inch round piece of steel in that gap may not be particularly comfortable for them. So then when we thin the top of that port down, we're allowing that horse to get that suction and that good comfortable mouth a little bit more easily. Also, surface area wise, the rounded portions of the bit are only touching on the bottom of the round. When we flatten that port out, we have a greater surface area touching the horse's tongue, which again they can feel better when that port is rotated up and off of the tongue. So a spoon mouth is a mouthpiece choice that I'm a pretty good fan of. I like them a fair bit. So this is going to be the front of our horse's face. There's his nose and jaw and ears up here. And here is his mouth area. Alright? The port of your bit is going to, no matter what the shank and purchase looks like, the port is going to pretty well line up with his lips. Okay, it may actually be lifted just a hair from the lip line. Okay, but it's pretty well going to be in that line. So, depending on how that port is oriented, we could have the top rings of our bit here, the port coming down, and the shank at that sort of an angle. Alright. We could have, if we had more of a backwards angle, we could have our purchase up here coming down, even though the port is still there, and our shank might be there. There are a lot of different orientations here that you can have. Why this matters. If let's say we want our horse to be on the vertical, okay, again, mouth there, the port is going to be on the vertical as well. So if we have a port that lines up perfectly with our rings and a straighter shank, that is going to be the style and balance of bit that is going to most naturally encourage the horse to ride on the vertical. Now I would like to get into some different shank shapes. And again, we'll be pretty generalized here, but this is going to blend into the balance of the bit, and this is really a seldom understood portion of these types of bits and a very important part of it. So let's do some very basic shanks here. A typical spade bit is going to have it's sort of the shank I had drawn there. It's going to have your upper ring, your purchase, your mouth is typically going to be there, and you're going to have a fairly straight shank coming down. Okay? You might have a cavalry shanked bit. So again, we would have a purchase, and we would be coming forward a little more. We're going to have our mouthpiece, and then the cavalry shank bit is going to be more like so. Alright? We can have a grazing bit. So again, we'll have our top ring, our purchase, our mouthpiece, and then our shanks are going to sweep back at that sort of an angle. Okay? So remember, for each of these bits, that our port is in line with our purchase. Okay? And by the way, on these differently shaped shanks, the way that you would determine the leverage is always the straight line distance from the bottom of the ring to the center of the mouthpiece. You wouldn't measure the curves. You would just go, from this point to that point. The same here. The angle that it goes at is completely irrelevant. It is only the distance from the mouthpiece to the bottom of the bottom ring that matters. Okay, so why do these things matter? The way our horse, please forgive my drawing here, but let's say this is the flat of our horse's face, then his nose and jowl, and his ears would be up there, and this is his mouth, and this is a horse standing at rest. When we insert the bit into the horse's mouth, and the port is lying here between his palate and his tongue, the balance that bit has is going to have a tendency to encourage that horse to hold his head in a certain way. Okay? So how do we check the balance on a bit? It is simply by holding the bars of the bit and seeing what it does. So you'll notice this correction bit is I hold it by the bars with 2 fingers. Okay? This bottom shank tends to want to go fairly forward, and the port tends to want to come back. So as a horse holds this bit in his mouth, the direction that port is taking would naturally tend to encourage him to be in front of the vertical, or nose out, as my head is here. Okay? Because that is how this bit hangs. If we add some weight to the back of a shank, and you'll notice lots of the spade bits and a lot of Western bits in general, they'll have like a large concho or something right here. What that weight tends to do is drive that balance of that bit so that it's going to sit more like so. And you'll notice with this type of bit going straight up and down, it would encourage this horse to naturally go to the vertical. Okay, so this is a really important thing to my mind to be paying attention to when you buy a bit or you're trying a bit out. As I've said in other videos, I come from a cutting horse background. We need a horse to be in front of the vertical because we have to have a horse that actually sees what he's doing, and in order to see a cow at the distance that we're working cattle, this is the position that the horse's head needs to be in. A cutting horse working on the vertical is blind. Not technically blind, but he certainly can't focus on the cow. So it is important for us to have a horse in front of the vertical. Doesn't mean that those horses aren't broke in the face, that I can't pick up the reins and bring him back. But when I give that horse slack and that bit goes to its natural balance inside his mouth, his head following the bit would be in a more forward nose out position. Okay? So, a bit that I might want to ride and show a cutting horse in would not have the same type of balance that I would want for a bit that I might be showing a reining horse or a working equitation or something else like that, where it would be important for me to have that horse in frame and on the vertical. The reason I find this important is if you're going to get one of these, what I'll call more cowboy balanced bits that is going to encourage a horse to be in front of the vertical, if you're going to start with a bit like that and then try to ride him in a manner where he's supposed to be broke at the pole and vertical, you are setting yourself up for a scenario where you're going to have to hold that horse all the time. It'd be very challenging to get that horse into self-carriage, because when you give him the slack, the bit is telling him to put his nose out. Okay, so really pay attention to what the balance of the bit is telling you. When you hold it by the bars, if it wants to sit straight up and down and the port is aligned and going straight up and down as it should be, that is a bit that is going to encourage a horse to ride on the vertical without you having to pick up on the reins and balance it. If you have a bit that's balancing more like these, where the port is coming back in an angle, that is a bit that's going to encourage a horse to be in front of the vertical. Okay? And this is something I would comfortably say 99% of people that are riding with curb bits are completely unaware of. So you need to know what task we have at hand for the horse. If we're simply trail riding, if we're actually cowboying, we're working cattle, we're doing something like that where a horse being on the vertical is not an important feature, then these types of balanced bits are no problem at all. If we're doing something where we want a horse on the vertical and sort of having that classical style, then getting into a bit that's balanced that way would certainly be beneficial. Now let me also say this. If we were to have a rider that had a bit balanced this way, and they were the type of rider that wanted to hold on to a horse all the time, you would very quickly have a horse well behind the vertical with a bit like this. Okay? So in that sort of case, one of these other bits may really be the ticket, because you're kind of overbalancing for the rider's hands. They're going to be holding too much, so we're bringing the horse really into the more natural position. Me personally, if I'm judging you in a competition, I would rather see self-carriage in a Western horse, that you're not having to hold them all the time to keep them into position. But I'm also not a stickler for a horse being on the vertical. I think we hammer that in a little too much. Being in frame and in collection is a position. It's not the position. And I truly dislike horses behind the vertical. Again, I come from a cutting background. To me, that is the elite of performance. Those horses are doing everything wide open, very fast, very hard. There's nothing you could say that's more performance than that. To me, those horses must be like this. I feel like we're bringing a horse into frame in collection, but collection is not the appropriate frame for every task. And I may disappoint some people saying that. I may confuse some people, but it is true. Collection is a frame. It's not the frame. There are a racehorse, for instance, that is running in collection would lose. Extension is a different frame entirely, and a completely valid one depending on what you're needing to do. So again, these different styles of bits, the different angulation of the port relative to the shank, they all have a specific purpose. So make sure that you know what your purpose is with your horse and what angle style you need relative to what you're fixing to do. One of the other things that the shank shape deals with is the range that you can rotate the mouthpiece. And these two pictures really have quite a bit to do with one another. I had a few bits up here a moment ago. One of them was a grazing bit, which would have the top ring and the purchase and the mouthpiece there, and then the shanks would sweep way back. So this angle here is very, very acute on a grazing bit, whereas on a completely straight shanked bit, it would be a much larger, up to 180 degree angle. I have read in multiple places where they talk about this angle and the direction that the shank takes as slowing down or delaying the action of the bit. Let me say this unequivocally. That is absolutely false. I have seen that in a lot of places, and I don't know where it started, but whoever started it was wrong. This is not an opinion thing. I'm fixing to show you exactly how it works. The relative angle here has nothing to do with the delay of action of the bit. The ratio in distance between the purchase and the shank is what controls that, not the angle of the shank. Okay? That being said, the angle of the shank plays in the balance, which we just looked at, and whether the horse is going to tend to want to be on the vertical or not. But it also does play into the range of the bit. So, if we were to look at this ring here, it corresponds with this point on my circle. Alright? And we're saying that the rider has taken up the reins 6 inches, and they have now pulled the shank back to that angle. Okay? Only a bit with a fairly loose curb chain and a very forward shank to begin with can move that far. Okay? And the reason is, let me change sides of the board here to be able to draw this, is where the rider is sitting. Okay, so our rider is up here and his hands are pulling on that ring through the reins. I can only pull that ring up to a point where this becomes a straight line. When my hands to the mouthpiece becomes a straight line, I can no longer rotate the shank of that bit. Okay? So, obviously, the further forward that shank is to begin with, the more opportunity I have to rotate it back until I form that straight line. So if my ring is already way back here, like on a grazing bit, I'm going to hit that straight line quickly. Okay? Now again, this is theoretical, because the reality of all of this is the point at which you can no longer rotate your shank is when your curb chain comes tight. When your curb chain comes tight, any pressure you put on the bit beyond that point is simply a crunch of the jaw and a pulling down of the headstall on the pole. So in truth, rotation of the port, the purchase, the shanks and all of that rotation ends when the curb chain comes tight. Okay? The shape of the shank has zero to do with any slower or delayed action in a bit. Pulling back on this shank at all causes rotation here, whether the shank started there or it started there. It is rotating the mouthpiece, it is rotating the purchase forward, period. That specific torque around this point is what makes it a curb bit. So if you hear anybody talking about that, little red flag, they don't really know what's going on. This has finished off our series a bit about bits, or at least the main three-part one that I had originally planned on. We may well have another video on other types of bridle rigs, like hackamores and things like that, gag bits. I mean, there are definitely categories that weren't covered in this. I do have a personal request that I would ask. Our YouTube channel has been growing at a pretty good rate. I've been really pretty happy with it, but I really would personally like to ask you to subscribe to our channel, to like the video, and please visit our Facebook page and like it as well. I've gotten very, very good response to these videos. This is all out there for free. We may at some point package this into a DVD and have all the information for sale. But you know, I've given you an awful lot of information and experience here for nothing. I would really appreciate the subscription and the liking of our Facebook page, and please share the videos. We're at a point where we're just trying to get our name out there. I feel like if people come and listen and they see what we have to say and they hear our message, that will win them over. I think we have a very good program and a very good understanding of horses and horsemanship. We are at a point, however, where we need the word to grow and to become a little bit better known. So please do me the favor of sharing this video and helping to spread the word about our message and what we can do for you. Thank you very much. Have a blessed day. It's Daniel Dauphin with Dauphin Horsemanship.